The rope hangs against the cliff face like a lifeline to hell, its hemp fibers already darkened with rain and something else Private First Class Desmond Doss doesn't want to think about. Below him, the 77th Infantry Division's aid station bustles with controlled chaos. Stretcher-bearers moving between canvas shelters, doctors hunched over makeshift operating tables, the steady percussion of artillery echoing across the Okinawan hills. Above him, beyond the sheer limestone wall of Hacksaw Ridge, the real war waits. "Check that line again, Doss," Captain Glover calls from beneath a rain-soaked poncho. "We're going up in 20 minutes. Doss runs his hands along the rope, testing each knot, each anchor point driven into the coral rock. The 77th Infantry Division has been stalled below this ridge for 3 days now, and everyone knows why. The Japanese defenders have turned the plateau above into a killing field, every approach covered by machine gun nests, every piece of cover ranged by mortars. What makes it worse is the wounded. Each assault leaves men scattered across the ridgetop, crying for help from shell holes and behind shattered tree stumps, too exposed for normal evacuation. "You sure about going back up there without a rifle?" The voice belongs to Sergeant Howell, a lean rifleman from Georgia whose skepticism about Doss's convictions has only deepened since they landed on Okinawa 3 weeks ago. "Seems like tempting fate, if you ask me." Doss doesn't look up from the rope. His medical bag sits heavy on his hip, packed with tourniquets, morphine syrettes and bandages that never seem like enough. The weight feels different from a rifle, less balanced, more awkward, but it's the weight he chose to carry. "I'll be fine, Sergeant. The Lord will provide." Howell spits into the mud. "Lord's been providing a lot of dead boys lately." The exchange draws attention from other soldiers preparing for the assault. Some nod in quiet agreement with Howell's cynicism. Others watch Doss with something approaching reverence. Word has spread about the unarmed medic who keeps climbing back up the ridge, who appears out of the smoke to drag wounded men to safety. What none of them can articulate is the strange tension his presence creates, admiration mixed with unease, respect shadowed by the fear that his refusal to kill somehow makes their own killing more necessary. Captain Glover emerges from the command shelter, rain streaming from his helmet. The young officer has aged years in the 3 days since they first attempted to take Hacksaw Ridge. His eyes move constantly between the rope line, the assembled troops, and the radio crackling with updates from other sectors of the Okinawa campaign. "Intelligence says the Japanese pulled back during the night," he announces to the gathered soldiers. "Could be a withdrawal, could be a trap. Either way, we're going up to find out." Doss finishes his inspection of the rope and stands, wiping wet hands on his uniform. The hemp line represents something different to each man looking at it. To the officers, it's a tactical asset, a way to evacuate casualties without exposing stretcher teams to enemy fire. To the enlisted men, it's a lifeline, proof that someone will come for them if they fall. To Doss, it's becoming something else entirely. A test of faith measured in body lengths and prayers whispered over each knot. The first time he used the rope, 2 days ago, it was simply the most practical way to lower a wounded rifleman with a shattered leg. Now, after a dozen evacuations, the rope feels like an extension of his own hands, rough hemp that bites into his palms, that stretches and creaks under the weight of broken men, that connects the killing ground above to the mercy of the aid station below. "Doss, you'll move with the second wave," Captain Glover continues. "Stay behind the riflemen until we secure a perimeter." "Yes, sir, but both men know the order is meaningless. Once the wounded start calling for help, Doss will go wherever he needs to go, rifle support or no rifle support. It's a pattern that has repeated itself across the Pacific, from the Philippines to Leyte to these rain-soaked hills of Okinawa. The unarmed medic who appears where no one should survive, who drags men to safety while bullets snap overhead, who whispers prayers that somehow carry over the sound of machine gun fire. Sergeant Howell checks his rifle one final time, chambering around with practiced efficiency. You know what bothers me most about you, Doss? What's that, Sergeant? It ain't that you won't fight. Plenty of ways to serve without pulling a trigger. It's that you make the rest of us feel like cowards just for being afraid. The accusation hangs in the humid air between them. Around the staging area, other soldiers pause in their preparations, sensing the weight of the moment. Doss looks at Howell directly, seeing not hostility but something more complicated, a man wrestling with his own courage, his own faith, his own understanding of what it means to climb that rope toward the sound of gunfire. I'm afraid too, Sergeant. Afraid every time I go up there. Then why do you keep going? Doss's answer comes quietly, almost lost in the percussion of distant artillery. Because they're calling for help, and I can hear them. The whistle for the assault cuts through the morning air. Sharp and final, soldiers shoulder their equipment and begin moving toward the rope lines and makeshift ladders that will carry them up the cliff face. Doss follows, his medical bag bouncing against his hip, his hands already planning the route he'll take if men start falling on the ridge above. As they begin the climb, the rope in his hand still warm from his inspection, Doss offers the prayer that has sustained him through 3 Pacific campaigns. Lord, please help me get one more. Just help me get one more. The hemp fibers are rough against his palms, and somewhere above, beyond the limestone rim of Hacksaw Ridge, wounded men are waiting for someone brave enough, or faithful enough, to come find them in the smoke. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The top of Hacksaw Ridge reveals itself like a broken promise. What the intelligence briefings described as lightly defended high ground spreads before the 77th Infantry Division as a moonscape of shattered coral, splintered trees, and shell craters deep enough to hide a man. The Japanese withdrawal, if it happened at all, left behind a killing field so expertly prepared that every step forward feels like walking into the sights of invisible rifles. Doss crouches behind the twisted remains of what might have been a banyan tree, his medical bag pressed against his chest as rifle fire crackles from cave mouths carved into the coral rock. The rope line disappears over the cliff edge 10 yards behind him, their lifeline to the aid station below already seeming impossibly far away. Contact front. Sergeant Howell's voice cuts through the morning air as muzzle flashes wink from a concealed position 30 yards ahead. The attack dissolves into chaos within minutes. What began as an organized advance becomes a desperate scramble for whatever cover the ridge offers. Men dive into shell holes and press themselves against coral outcroppings while machine gun fire rakes the ground where they stood moments before. The Japanese defenders, far from retreating, have simply waited for the Americans to commit themselves to the open ground. Captain Glover's voice rises above the gunfire, trying to maintain control of an attack that has already fractured. "Second squad, move left, suppressive fire on that cave mouth." But the orders seem to dissolve in the humid air. The ridgetop stretches 400 yards of broken ground between the Americans and the next defensive line, and every yard is covered by interlocking fields of fire. What makes it worse is the terrain itself, coral limestone that splinters under artillery, creating razor-sharp fragments that turn every explosion into a shower of cutting stone. Doss moves differently than the riflemen around him. Where they advance by fire and movement, he reads the ground for different possibilities. Which shell holes offer protected approaches to wounded men? Which ridges might shield an evacuation route? How the smoke from burning equipment drifts across the battlefield. His medical training has taught him to see suffering before tactics, to hear cries for help over the sound of his own fear. "Medic!" The call comes from somewhere ahead and to the right, thin and desperate through the gunfire. Without thinking, Doss begins moving toward the voice, crawling forward over coral fragments that bite through his uniform. Behind him, he hears Sergeant Howell cursing as he tries to lay down covering fire with a rifle that keeps jamming in the humid air. The irony isn't lost on either of them. The armed man pinned down while the unarmed medic crawls into enemy fire. The wounded soldier lies in a shell crater barely wide enough for two men, his left leg twisted at an angle that makes Doss's stomach turn. Private Martinez, a kid from New Mexico who joined the 77th Infantry Division as a replacement after Leyte. Blood seeps through his uniform, dark against the coral dust, but his eyes are alert and tracking. "Can't feel my leg, Doc. Can't move it." Doss slides into the crater, his medical bag already open. Morphine syringe first, then a pressure bandage to slow the bleeding, then the delicate work of splinting the leg with whatever materials the battlefield offers. Around them, rifle fire continues in sporadic bursts, the Japanese defenders content to wait for clear targets rather than waste ammunition. "We're gonna get you out of here, Martinez. Just stay calm." "How?" The kid's voice carries a note of panic. "Can't walk. Can barely crawl." Doss looks back toward the cliff edge, calculating distance and cover, 50 yards of open ground to the rope line, with enemy positions overlooking most of the route. In the traditional infantry handbook, evacuating a casualty from this position would require a full squad and suppressive fire from multiple weapons, but Doss has learned to think beyond the handbook, to find possibilities where tactical doctrine sees only problems. "I'm gonna drag you back to the rope. Gonna take some time, but we'll make it." The evacuation becomes a lesson in patience and faith. Moving 5 yards at a time, Doss drags Martinez backward across the coral, timing each movement to the rhythm of enemy fire. When the machine guns chatter, they freeze, pressing themselves against the broken ground. When the firing pauses, the gunners scanning for new targets or changing ammunition. They move, Doss pulling Martinez by his equipment harness while the wounded man grits his teeth against the pain. The other soldiers watch when they can, torn between admiration and disbelief. Sergeant Howell, still struggling with his jammed rifle, sees the unarmed medic accomplish what a fire team couldn't. Movement under fire, sustained and purposeful, driven by something stronger than tactical training. "Son of a bitch," he whispers to himself. "Son of a bitch actually did it." When they reach the rope line, Doss works quickly to secure Martinez in an improvised harness, using straps from his own equipment and torn pieces of the wounded man's uniform. The hemp rope creaks under the weight, stretching and settling as Doss tests the rigging. Below, voices from the aid station indicate that medics are ready to receive the casualty. "Tell my mother I wasn't scared," Martinez says as Doss prepares to lower him over the cliff edge. "You can tell her yourself when you get home." The lowering takes 10 minutes. 10 minutes of hand-over-hand rope work while enemy fire continues around them. Doss's palms burn from the hemp fibers, his shoulders ache from the weight, but the rope holds. When Martinez disappears over the cliff edge and voices below confirm his safe arrival, Doss allows himself one moment of relief before turning back toward the ridge. More voices are calling for help now, scattered across the coral wasteland where the attack has stalled. Each voice represents another decision, another calculation of risk and faith, another test of the rope that connects the killing ground to mercy. Captain Glover appears at Doss's elbow, his uniform torn and his face grim. "We're pulling back in 15 minutes. Orders from battalion." "What about the wounded?" "We'll get them when we can establish proper fire support." But both men know what "when we can" means in this kind of fight. The wounded will lie in their shell holes through the heat of the Okinawan day, through the long night when Japanese infiltrators move across the ridge, through another morning if they're lucky enough to survive that long. Doss looks at the rope in his hands, then back across the ridge, where voices still call for help through the smoke. The hemp feels different now, not just equipment, but responsibility measured in fiber and knots. Somewhere between Martinez's evacuation and this moment, the rope has become an extension of his own conscience, a physical manifestation of the promise he made when he refused to carry a weapon, that he would find another way to serve, another way to save lives in a place designed for killing. "I hear them calling, Captain." "Doss, that's an order. We're pulling back." The moment stretches between them, heavy with implications neither man wants to voice. Around them, the 77th Infantry Division begins its tactical withdrawal from Hacksaw Ridge, leaving behind equipment, ammunition, and wounded men who trusted that someone would come for them when they fell. Doss coils the rope carefully, his movements deliberate and measured. "Yes, sir, I understand." But as the captain moves away to organize the withdrawal, Doss doesn't follow. Instead, he secures the rope to its anchor points and checks his medical bag one more time. The voices are still calling from across the ridge, thin and desperate through the gunfire. And somewhere between duty and conscience, between orders and faith, he makes a decision that will echo through the rest of his life. The afternoon heat settles over Hacksaw Ridge like a suffocating blanket, turning the coral dust into a fine powder that coats everything: uniforms, weapons, the dried blood around shell holes where wounded men lie waiting. 3 hours have passed since the 77th Infantry Division's tactical withdrawal, and the ridgetop has fallen into an eerie quiet, broken only by distant sniper fire and the occasional cry for help that drifts down to the staging area below. Dr. Kenneth Stedman wipes sweat from his forehead as he works over another stretcher case in the aid station. 26 years old, fresh from medical school, and already tired in ways he never learned about in anatomy class. The wounded keep coming down that rope, not in the organized flow of a proper evacuation, but one at a time, lowered from above by hands that refuse to follow orders. "How many does this make?" he asks Corpsman Riley, a Navy medic whose steady hands have become essential to the aid station's function. 12, since the withdrawal order," Riley answers without looking up from a pressure bandage, all lowered by that medic who won't carry a rifle. "Doctor." Stedman glances toward the cliff face, where the rope disappears over the limestone rim. Radio chatter from other units fighting across Okinawa fills the command tent with reports of stalled advances, heavy casualties, and Japanese defenders who fight from prepared positions with suicidal determination. But here, below Hacksaw Ridge, the war has compressed into something more personal. One man refusing to abandon the wounded. One rope connecting the killing ground to mercy. Is he still up there? Far as we know. Captain sent a runner up 20 minutes ago, but he came back without Doss. The implications hang in the humid air between them. Disobeying a direct order in combat carries consequences that can echo through a soldier's entire life. Court-martial, imprisonment, disgrace. But abandoning wounded men carries consequences that echo through a man's soul, and everyone in the aid station understands which burden feels heavier to someone like Desmond Doss. Up on the ridge, Doss moves through the afternoon heat like a ghost, crawling from shell hole to shell hole, following voices that grow weaker as the hours pass. His medical bag is nearly empty, most of his morphine used, bandages running low, water almost gone. The coral has shredded his uniform and torn his hands, leaving him looking more like a casualty than a rescuer. But the rope remains secure at the cliff edge, and wounded men keep appearing at its terminus, lowered into the grateful hands of the aid station staff. Each evacuation follows the same pattern. Locate the wounded man by voice, provide emergency aid while lying flat to avoid sniper fire, drag or carry him across broken ground to the rope, then the careful work of rigging and lowering while machine gun fire crackles from invisible positions. What started as a medical technique has evolved into something approaching art, the science of moving wounded men through spaces designed to prevent movement. Doss, you crazy son of a bitch. The voice belongs to Corporal Jackson, a rifleman from Ohio who took shrapnel in both legs during the morning assault. He's been lying in a crater 50 yards from the cliff edge since the withdrawal, watching the unarmed medic appear and disappear like a figure from a fever dream. "How many you got out so far?" "Don't know. Stopped counting." Doss crawls into Jackson's crater, already reaching for his nearly empty medical bag. The corporal's wounds aren't life-threatening, painful but manageable, which makes him a lower priority than men bleeding out in more distant shell holes. But he's conscious and alert, which makes him valuable for different reasons. "I can see 3 more from here," Jackson says, pointing across the ridge. 2 in that crater by the burned tree, 1 behind that pile of rocks. Think the one by the rocks might be Lieutenant Morrison. The information creates another moral equation that has no clean solution. Lieutenant Morrison is an officer, trained and experienced, valuable to future operations. But he's also furthest from the cliff edge, requiring the most dangerous approach. The 2 men by the burned tree are closer but exposed to fire from at least 2 enemy positions. And Jackson himself needs evacuation, though his wounds allow him to wait. "Can you hold on a while longer, Corporal?" "I ain't going anywhere." "But, Doc..." Jackson's voice carries a note of concern that has nothing to do with his own condition. "Radio chatter says they're planning artillery on this ridge, gonna soften it up for tomorrow's assault." The implications sink in immediately. Artillery preparation means saturation fire, high explosive and white phosphorus, designed to destroy enemy positions regardless of what else might be caught in the target area. Any wounded men still on the ridge when the guns open up will become casualties of their own army's fire support. When? Hour, maybe 2, depends on ammunition resupply. Doss looks across the ridge, calculating distances and time, weighing the mathematics of rescue against the clock of incoming artillery. 3 men confirmed, possibly others he hasn't located yet, and a rope that can handle 1 evacuation every 15 minutes if everything goes perfectly. The arithmetic is brutal and clear. He can't get them all. "Help me with something, Corporal. When I start moving those other boys, you spot for me. Let me know if you see enemy movement." Jackson nods, understanding his role in what has become an improvised rescue operation. As Doss crawls away toward the 2 men by the burned tree, the corporal settles into his crater with his rifle, providing the overwatch that doctrine calls for, but that circumstances haven't allowed. The next hour passes in a blur of crawling, bandaging, and rope work. Doss evacuates the 2 men from the crater by the burned tree, one unconscious with a head wound, the other delirious from blood loss, but still alive. Each lowering takes precious minutes, and each trip back across the ridge exposes him to renewed enemy fire. The Japanese defenders seem puzzled by his persistence, occasionally taking shots, but not with the sustained intensity of a major engagement. When he finally reaches Lieutenant Morrison behind the pile of rocks, the officer is conscious but barely responsive, a piece of shrapnel buried in his chest just below his right collarbone. The wound is serious but not immediately fatal, the kind of injury that could be treated successfully at the aid station but would prove fatal if left untreated through an artillery barrage. "Doss?" Morrison's voice is weak but clear. "Thought everyone pulled back." "Yes, sir, just me and a few others still up here." "You need to get out of here, son. Heard on the radio. Artillery mission planned." "I know, sir. That's why we need to move." The evacuation of Lieutenant Morrison takes longer than the others, partly because of his weight and partly because of the care required to avoid aggravating his chest wound. By the time Doss lowers him over the cliff edge, the afternoon light is beginning to slant toward evening, and the distant rumble of artillery pieces being moved into position carries across the Okinawan hills. Corporal Jackson waves him back to the crater, pointing toward a new voice calling for help from somewhere beyond the burned tree. "Think there's one more over there, Doc. Hard to tell from here." Doss checks his watch, a gift from his mother that has somehow survived 3 Pacific campaigns. If Jackson is right about the artillery timing, he has perhaps 30 minutes to locate and evacuate 1 more casualty before the ridge becomes untenable for any living thing. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The rope waits at the cliff edge, hemp fibers now stained with coral dust and the evidence of a dozen impossible evacuations. Somewhere across the ridge, a wounded soldier calls for help through the gathering dusk, his voice growing weaker with each passing minute. And at the aid station below, Dr. Stedman and Corpsman Riley prepare to receive whatever casualties one unarmed medic can deliver before the artillery turns Hacksaw Ridge into a landscape too broken for mercy. The artillery preparation begins at sunset, distant thunder rolling across the Okinawan hills as the big guns range their fire on targets throughout the Japanese defensive line. Doss crouches at the cliff edge, his hands working automatically to secure Corporal Jackson in the rope harness, while the sound of incoming shells grows steadily closer to Hacksaw Ridge. Each blast sends tremors through the coral limestone, small fragments of rock pattering down like deadly rain. "Doc, you got maybe 10 minutes before this whole ridge goes to hell," Jackson says through gritted teeth as Doss checks the rigging one final time. "I know. Get down to the aid station and tell them no more casualties coming tonight." But even as he says the words, another cry for help drifts across the ridge from somewhere beyond the burned tree. The voice is weak, barely audible over the sound of distant artillery, but unmistakably American, unmistakably wounded, unmistakably waiting for someone to answer. Doss lowers Jackson over the cliff edge with practiced efficiency, the hemp rope singing through his hands as he controls the descent. When voices from below confirm the corporal's safe arrival, Doss secures the line and turns back toward the ridge interior one final time. The mathematics are simple and terrible. He can reach the wounded man and get him back to the rope, or he can evacuate himself before the artillery arrives, but not both. The decision makes itself the same way decisions have been making themselves since he first refused to carry a rifle. Faith expressed through action, conscience translated into movement across broken ground. Doss checks his medical bag. 2 morphine syrettes left, a few bandages, a pressure dressing that has seen better days, and begins crawling toward the voice calling through the gathering darkness. Private Tommy Wilkins lies in a shell crater 20 yards beyond the burned tree, his right arm twisted beneath him and his breathing shallow with shock. 19 years old, from a farm in Kansas, drafted into the 77th Infantry Division 6 months ago, and shipped to the Pacific with 2 weeks of additional training. The kind of soldier the war machine churns through by the thousands, except that tonight he has become the focus of one man's entire universe. "Easy, son. I'm gonna get you out of here." Wilkins's eyes struggle to focus on Doss's face in the fading light. "Can't move my arm. Something's wrong inside." Doss runs his hands over the soldier's torso, finding the telltale rigidity that suggests internal bleeding. A morphine syrette goes into Wilkins's thigh, followed by a pressure bandage over the arm wound, but the real injury lies hidden beneath his uniform, the kind of damage that requires surgery within hours or becomes a death sentence. "We're going to get you to the aid station, son. Doctors down there know what to do." The trip back to the cliff edge becomes a race against time, measured in heartbeats and artillery rounds. Each shell impact comes closer to the ridge, the Japanese defensive positions receiving methodical attention from American gunners who have spent days plotting coordinates and calculating trajectories. What started as distant thunder has become a steady percussion that shakes the ground and fills the air with coral dust and the smell of high explosives. Doss drags Wilkins across the broken terrain, using techniques learned through hours of desperate practice, keeping low, moving during the brief pauses between shell impacts, using every piece of cover the ridge offers. The wounded soldier drifts in and out of consciousness, his weight becoming dead weight that turns every yard into a struggle against exhaustion and the clock of incoming artillery. When they reach the rope, Doss works with hands that shake from fatigue and adrenaline. The harness rigging that has become routine now feels clumsy and slow, complicated by Wilkins's injuries and the steadily increasing tempo of artillery fire. Each shell burst sends fragments whistling overhead, some close enough to embed themselves in the coral just yards away. "Medic down below! Last one coming down!" The rope stretches under Wilkins's weight, hemp fibers singing with tension as Doss begins the lowering process. Hand over hand, controlling the descent while fragments of shattered coral rain down from nearby shell impacts. The aid station seems impossibly far below, voices calling up through the dust and smoke, hands reaching up to guide the wounded soldier to safety. Halfway through the lowering, a shell lands close enough to throw Doss against the coral cliff face, the impact stunning him for a moment that feels like eternity. The rope jerks in his hands, Wilkins's weight threatening to tear the hemp from his grip. For one terrible second, Doss feels his hold slipping, sees the wounded soldier spinning at the end of the line above the rocks below. Then training takes over, muscle memory from dozens of previous evacuations. His hands find their grip, the rope steadies, and Wilkins continues his descent toward the waiting medics. When voices below confirm his safe arrival, Doss collapses against the cliff edge. His palms raw and bleeding from the hemp fibers, his breathing coming in gasps that have nothing to do with the physical exertion. The artillery barrage opens in earnest 5 minutes later, high explosive and white phosphorus turning the ridgetop into a landscape from some fever dream of destruction. Doss presses himself against the coral rock face, feeling each impact through the stone, watching the rope dance and jerk with each concussion. The hemp line that has carried 15 wounded men to safety now seems impossibly fragile, a thread connecting his position to the world below. Through the chaos of the barrage, he hears other voices calling, Japanese voices from the cave positions that have controlled the ridge for days. Cries of surprise, pain, fear. Human sounds from men who have become targets in the same mathematical equation that once targeted American soldiers. The artillery makes no distinction between uniforms or languages, dealing death with the impartial precision of calculated coordinates. When the guns finally stop, silence settles over Hacksaw Ridge like a physical weight. No more cries for help drift across the coral wasteland. No movement disturbs the smoke and dust that rises from shattered positions. The ridge has become what artillery is designed to create, a moonscape too broken for human habitation, cleared for tomorrow's assault by fire that leaves nothing alive in its wake. Doss begins his own descent, hand over hand down the rope that has defined his war for the past 12 hours. His medical bag hangs empty against his hip, his uniform torn and blackened, his hands leaving bloody prints on the hemp line. Below, the aid station waits with bright lights and voices and the warmth of men who have spent the evening receiving the wounded he lowered from above. Dr. Stedman looks up as Doss appears in the aid station's entrance, swaying with exhaustion and something deeper than fatigue. "How many, son?" 15, maybe 16, lost count somewhere. The number hangs in the lamplit air between them, heavy with implications that will take years to fully understand. 15 men who will see home again because one unarmed medic refused to follow orders, refused to abandon the wounded, refused to believe that tactical withdrawal means leaving anyone behind. Corman Riley appears with a cup of coffee and a blanket, small gestures that feel enormous after 12 hours of carrying other men's pain. Tommy Wilkins is gonna make it. Surgery went well. Docs think he'll keep the arm. Doss nods, too tired for relief, too numb for celebration. Somewhere in his mind, he can still hear the rope singing under weight, still feel hemp fibers cutting into his palms, still see faces looking up at him from shell holes and crater bottoms. The sounds will stay with him, not just the artillery and gunfire, but the quieter sounds, the whispered prayers between evacuations, the "thank you" spoken by men who thought they were going to die alone on a ridge in the Pacific. The creak of hemp rope under the weight of human suffering transformed into human salvation. Outside, the rope still hangs against the cliff face, ready for tomorrow's assault, tomorrow's wounded, tomorrow's test of how much one man can carry in the name of faith and conscience. But tonight, it rests empty against the coral rock, a simple line that has become something more, a physical manifestation of the distance between ordinary courage and the kind of love that refuses to let go. 6 months after Hacksaw Ridge, Doss sits in a military hospital in San Francisco, his hands trembling as he tries to hold a cup of coffee steady enough to drink. The medal ceremony is scheduled for next week. The Congressional Medal of Honor, they tell him, the highest decoration the nation can bestow. But the citation they've written, the clean narrative of heroism under fire, feels like a story about someone else, some mythical figure who never existed except in the imagination of men who write reports from behind desks. Dr. Sarah Mitchell watches from across the room as Doss struggles with the simple act of drinking coffee. A psychiatrist specializing in combat trauma, she has spent weeks listening to stories from men who survived the Pacific War, learning to read the signs that separate healing from merely surviving. In Doss's case, the signs are subtle but unmistakable. The way his hands shake when he hears rope being used in the hospital rigging, the sudden silences when artillery practice echoes from the nearby base, the nightmares that wake him calling names that don't appear in any official records. "Tell me about the rope," she says quietly. Doss sets down the coffee cup, his hands still trembling slightly. 6 months of medical treatment for the wounds he received in later fighting on Okinawa, shrapnel injuries, hearing damage, malnutrition, but the invisible wounds resist easier categorization. What do you want to know? How it felt in your hands? What you remember about the texture, the weight? The question seems to unlock something that official debriefings and medal paperwork have left untouched. Doss's voice becomes quieter, more distant, as if he's describing something that happened to someone else in a previous life. Hemp rope, Navy standard. Rough enough to give you grip, but smooth enough to slide when you needed it to. After the first few evacuations, it started to feel personal, like it was listening to what I needed it to do. Doctor. Mitchell makes notes, but carefully, trying not to interrupt the flow of memory with the scratch of pencil on paper. "Tell me about the men you evacuated." 15 confirmed. Maybe 16. I lost count during the artillery. "No, I mean, tell me about them as individuals, what you remember about each one." The question creates a silence that stretches between them, heavy with implications that neither fully understands. In the official records, the evacuations have been compressed into statistics. 15 or 16 American lives saved, a tactical success that supported the larger strategic objectives of the Okinawa campaign. But in Doss's memory, each evacuation carries specific weight. The way Private Martinez gripped his equipment belt during the lowering, the delirious prayers that Private Kowalski whispered while Doss applied pressure bandages, the way Lieutenant Morrison tried to give him orders, even while being rigged for evacuation. "They trusted me," he finally says. "That's what I remember most. They stopped asking how I was going to get them down, and just trusted that somehow it would happen." How did that feel? Terrifying. The honesty of the answer surprises both of them. In the mythology already growing around the Hacksaw Ridge evacuations, fear doesn't play a prominent role. The official narrative focuses on courage, faith, determination, the qualities that make for inspiring speeches and recruitment posters. But sitting in the hospital room, 6 months removed from the coral dust and hemp rope, Doss can acknowledge what he couldn't voice during the action itself, that he was more afraid during those 12 hours than he had ever been in his life. What terrified you most? Dropping one of them, having the rope break or the rigging fail, or my hands give out. 15 men trusting their lives to knots I tied and a rope I couldn't really test. Every lowering felt like a prayer that physics would cooperate with faith. Dr. Mitchell sets aside her notepad, recognizing that what they're discussing has moved beyond the realm of standard psychiatric evaluation. Desmond, in your opinion, what really happened on that ridge? The question hangs in the air between them, weighted with implications that reach beyond medical assessment into territories of faith, conscience, and the mysterious intersection between human will and divine providence. Doss considers his answer carefully, knowing that whatever he says will be measured against the official record, against the citation being prepared for next week's ceremony, against the growing legend of the unarmed medic who single-handedly evacuated 15 men from an impossible position. I think I learned something about the weight of rope. What do you mean? When you lower a man over a cliff, the rope carries more than just his body weight. It carries his trust, his hope, his wife's prayers, his children's future. Every strand of hemp becomes responsible for everything that man might do or become if he lives to see home again. The observation strikes Dr. Mitchell as both profound and troubling, the kind of insight that reveals how deeply the experience has marked him, how far beyond normal combat stress his psychological landscape has traveled. And how do you carry that kind of responsibility? One prayer at a time, one man at a time, one handhold at a time. Is that sustainable? The question creates another silence, this one edged with implications that neither wants to voice directly. Doss's hands have steadied somewhat during their conversation, but the tremor remains, subtle evidence of nervous system damage that may or may not heal with time. The hearing loss is permanent, high-frequency damage from artillery that will affect his ability to hear certain voices, certain tones, for the rest of his life. And beneath the documented physical injuries lies something harder to quantify, the weight of carrying 15 men's lives in hemp rope and tired hands, measured against a faith that never promised the load would be easy to bear. I don't know, he admits. Some nights I wake up thinking I'm still on the ridge, still hear voices calling for help, still feel the rope burning through my hands. What do the voices say? Thank you. And don't drop me. Sometimes help me get home. Doctor. Mitchell closes her notepad entirely, recognizing that what she's hearing reaches beyond the scope of standard psychiatric treatment into territories that require different kinds of healing, different kinds of professional guidance. What does the citation say about that night? Doss reaches into his pocket and unfolds a piece of paper, the official language that will accompany next week's medal ceremony. He reads slowly, his voice flat and distant. Private First Class Desmond T. Doss repeatedly braved enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers, lowering them one by one down the face of a 400-foot cliff to safety. His actions saved the lives of at least 15 men. He stops reading and folds the paper carefully. It's all true. And none of it's true. What do you mean? It was one rope, 15 men, 12 hours. But reading it like that makes it sound like something planned, something heroic. It wasn't heroic. It was just necessary. The distinction seems to exhaust him, and Dr. Mitchell recognizes that their session has reached its natural boundary. Next week, Doss will stand before cameras and crowds, accepting recognition for actions that have already begun their transformation from memory into legend. But in this hospital room, 6 months after Hacksaw Ridge, what remains is simpler and more complex than any medal can acknowledge. One man's hands still learning to hold coffee steady, still feeling hemp rope burn through his palms in dreams, still carrying the weight of 15 men's trust measured in fiber and faith. 23 years later, Doss stands in his workshop in Georgia, his hands, now steady with age and acceptance, working hemp rope into the same knots he learned during those 12 hours on Hacksaw Ridge. The rope is different now, softer, purchased from a hardware store for home use rather than military specifications. But the muscle memory remains, the particular twist of fiber that creates strength under load, the spacing of knots that distributes weight evenly across the line. His grandson Bobby watches from a nearby stool, 8 years old, and fascinated by his grandfather's patient work with the rope. Bobby knows some version of the story, simplified for a child's understanding, focused on courage and helping others rather than the weight of fear and faith that actually sustained those evacuations. The boy has heard the word hero applied to his grandfather, but what he sees is simply an old man who knows interesting things about knots. "Grandpa, why do you still practice those knots?" Doss pauses in his work, considering how to answer a question that reaches into territories he rarely discusses, even with family. Through the workshop window, Georgia sunshine illuminates a peaceful afternoon, far removed from coral dust and machine gun fire, but the rope in his hands connects this moment to that night. Hemp fiber serving as a bridge across decades and distance. Because muscle memory is important, Bobby. When you need to do something under pressure, your hands have to know what to do without your mind getting in the way. But you don't rescue people anymore. The observation is innocent, matter of fact, in the way that children state obvious truths. But it carries implications that Doss has spent 23 years learning to navigate. The difference between actions that define a life and actions that define a moment. Between the man who lowered 15 soldiers from Hacksaw Ridge and the man who teaches Sunday school and fixes neighbors' farm equipment in rural Georgia. A knock at the workshop door interrupts their conversation. James Morrison stands in the doorway, silver-haired now, and wearing a business suit that marks him as successful in the civilian pursuits that followed his recovery from the shrapnel wound he received on Okinawa. Lieutenant Morrison has become Colonel Morrison, retired, and now drives down from Atlanta once a year for conversations that never quite address what happened on the ridge, but circle around it like planets around a distant star. "Hello, Doss. Hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Just showing Bobby here some rope work. Come on in, Jim." The two men shake hands with the careful warmth of people who share experiences that resist easy discussion. Morrison notices the rope in Doss's hands, recognizes the knots, understands immediately what lesson was being passed from grandfather to grandson. Still teaching the important skills, I see. Keeps the hands limber. Bobby looks between the two old men, sensing undercurrents he doesn't understand, but recognizing the particular quality of respect that flows between combat veterans. His grandfather has mentioned Morrison before. A good officer who got hurt and came home, but the boy doesn't know that Morrison was the last man Doss evacuated before the artillery barrage, doesn't understand that the rope currently in his grandfather's hands once carried Morrison's life in its fibers. "Bobby, why don't you go help your grandmother with the garden? Colonel Morrison and I have some catching up to do." The boy nods and heads toward the house, leaving the two men alone with the rope and 23 years of mostly unspoken conversation. Morrison settles into a chair across from Doss's workbench, his eyes fixed on the hemp line that continues to move through his former medic's hands. "Got the letter about the documentary crew?" Morrison says eventually. "They want to interview surviving veterans about Okinawa, specifically about Hacksaw Ridge." Doss nods, but doesn't stop his rope work. Over the years, there have been articles, interviews, speeches at veterans' gatherings. Each retelling polishes the story a little more, removes another rough edge, transforms the terrified prayers and burning rope into something that resembles the official citation. He has learned to tell the story people want to hear while keeping the heavier truths for moments like this, conversations with men who shared the weight. "You planning to participate?" "Thinking about it. They want to know about the man who saved my life. How do I explain that he was more scared than any of us, but kept moving anyway?" The question hangs between them, fundamental and unanswerable. Morrison has carried his own version of that night for 23 years. the memory of lying behind a pile of rocks with shrapnel in his chest, watching an unarmed medic crawl through enemy fire to reach him. What he remembers most clearly isn't the rescue itself, but the look in Doss's eyes. Not fearlessness, but something deeper, the kind of determination that operates in spite of fear, rather than in its absence. The rope helped, Doss says quietly. Having something concrete to do with my hands. Lower one man, check the knots, pray, then go find the next one. Is that what you tell people when they ask about courage? I tell them courage isn't the absence of fear, it's rope work under pressure. Morrison laughs, recognizing the particular mixture of practical wisdom and spiritual insight that has characterized every conversation he's had with Doss over the past 2 decades. Think that'll make it into the documentary? Probably not. People prefer cleaner stories. They sit quietly for several minutes, the only sound the gentle movement of rope through patient hands. Outside, the Georgia afternoon continues its peaceful progression toward evening, marked by birdsong and the distant sound of Bobby helping his grandmother in the garden. But inside the workshop, time moves differently, measured by the rhythm of knots that connect present safety to past terror, current peace to former necessity. You ever wonder what would have happened if you'd followed orders that night, if you'd come down with the rest of us? Doss considers the question, his hands pausing in their work. Every day for about 5 years. Then I realized it was the wrong question. What's the right question? Whether I can live with the weight of what I did carry, not the weight of what I might have left behind. Morrison nods, understanding that they've reached the heart of something that resists easy articulation. The mathematics of survival and loss, the arithmetic of rescue and abandonment, the calculus of rope and faith, and 15 men lowered into the arms of medical personnel who waited in the darkness below. As evening approaches, Morrison prepares to leave for his drive back to Atlanta. At the workshop door, he turns back toward Doss, who continues his patient work with the rope. For what it's worth, I never thanked you properly. No need. We were all just doing what needed doing. No, Doss. We were following orders and trying not to die. You were doing something else entirely. After Morrison leaves, Doss continues working with the rope as darkness settles over the Georgia countryside. His hands move automatically through the familiar patterns, creating strength from individual fibers, distributing load across multiple strands, building systems that can bear weight when weight must be borne. When Bobby returns from helping in the garden, he finds his grandfather coiling the completed rope, storing it carefully in a wooden box that contains other projects, other preparations for scenarios that may never arise, but that require readiness nonetheless. Will you teach me those knots sometime, Grandpa? Doss looks at his grandson, 8 years old, growing up in a world where such skills seem unnecessary, preparing for a life that hopefully will never require the kind of courage that rope work represents. Someday, Bobby, when your hands are big enough to grip the rope properly. If this story reminded you that behind every medal, there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. But as he closes the wooden box, Doss understands that what he's really teaching, through knots and rope work, through patient demonstration of skills that connect effort to outcome, isn't preparation for war, but preparation for life itself. The understanding that some loads can only be carried one handhold at a time, that trust sometimes requires literal faith in hemp, and hemp requires literal faith in the hands that work it, that the distance between safety and danger is often measured in the strength of knots tied by people who refuse to let go. Outside, the Georgia night settles over a peaceful countryside, where children grow up learning different lessons than their grandfathers learned, where rope work is a hobby rather than a matter of life and death, where the weight of other men's lives is rarely tested against the strength of individual faith. But in the workshop, The box of rope waits, ready for whatever weight the future might require, coiled and prepared by hands that learned their patience on a cliff face in the Pacific, guided by prayers whispered between evacuations, sustained by the memory of 15 men who trusted hemp fiber and tired hands to carry them home.